Hi, David Taylor, or Mr Pelargonium as people like to call me. We're going to be looking at all the different types of plants that I grow, which will give you a good background into the many different types of pelargoniums that there are. So let's get going. Okay, well, it's good to be back. I'm going to do a little bit of a run through of all of the different types of plants that I grow, and the reason for that, I've been asked about all of the different types that there are that people can get hold of. The methods of getting them these days is relatively difficult because we've got so few specialist pelargonium nurseries these days. So to get a good number of the ones that I grow, you will have to go to specialist nurseries like Fibrex, who are based in Pebworth, just south of Stratford upon Avon, where you get a really good selection of all of the different types that there are to grow of pelargonium. Okay, well, let's start with the zonal pelargoniums. Now, these are the ones that are more often marketed as geraniums in the summer at garden centres and places like that aren't specialist in pelargoniums themselves. But they are pelargoniums. They're tender perennials, just like all of the plants that originated from species, the majority from South Africa. Now, zonals are generally named because the majority of them, the good majority of them, have some type of zoning on the leaf. Now, an example of this is one of my plants, and this has got a very distinctive zone. Now, some of them have a more distinctive zone than others. The zone is usually quite dark, sort of forming, I suppose, a deep bronze colour would be the colouring of the majority of them. But they do take various shapes and various forms. But there's a good example of a zonal pelargonium. Now, this is one of the varieties that I've raised over the years. And, you know, you get a good head of bloom running up above the plant. Now, they basically come in three different sizes. You get the very large, strong growing ones, which are called basic zonals, in conforming to exhibition standards. We have what are known as basic zonals. They are very large growing plants, and you can grow individual plants really to quite a size. These ones are all for exhibition. They're in a 6-inch pot, and that, you know, they can grow quite big. The training of them can sometimes be a little bit tricky because we are wanting to ensure that they keep relatively tight and relatively compact. But they do quite, they will get very big and strong. If you want to pot them out into a really big pot, they can fill it, certainly in a sort of summer period. Now, in general, basic zonals are really only available from specialist nurseries, such as Fibrex, as I mentioned earlier. Now, some of the big commercial outlets do sell some of the slightly larger ones, but they're usually bred, using stock that conforms to being very tight and a bit smaller than what we generally use for a basic zonal. So you just need to keep your eye open from that. And realistically, these types are only available from specialist pelargonium nurseries. Now, next down are the dwarf zonals. Similar things, they will have more or less of a zoned leaf, rounded, and they conform to sort of growing in exhibition terms up to a 4.5-inch pot. But these are the sorts of plants that you can use in your summer baskets and summer tubs, because they will grow a bit bigger if you give them a bit more room. They're not too fussy. In the show terms, we have this floribunda class, which means that you grow a dwarf size plant into a bigger pot, up to a 6-inch pot, which produces a floribunda type plant. And I've got an example of one of those just up here. This is just beginning to flower. This is one of my own. This is Gosbert Susanna. You may have seen it before, but it's got the difference is that you've still got the very dwarf leaves, which are relatively small in terms of looking at a basic zonal, but we've got a bigger plant, and this shows you how the dwarfs can fill a space and are particularly useful for tubs and baskets in the summer period. And then the final size, just going very small, are the little miniature zonals. Again, they've got a small rounded leaf with more or less of a zone on the leaves, a dark bronzish zone. Now these are ideal if you've just not got much room, or a very small greenhouse, or say a brightish windowsill without a lot of heat on it. And you can keep these quite happily in say a 3.5 or 4 inch pot, and they won't get too big at all. They are naturally very small growing plants, and you know, they're ideal. This one, I mean, is pretty decent actually. It's hoping to get this to the show this year. Nicely tight and compact, and that's how they grow. They don't need a lot of space. Also don't like a lot of watering. They like to be kept relatively dry, miniatures, particularly if you're growing them indoors. If you've got, you know, a nice bright windowsill and put a number of miniatures of different types along it, they can look really effective, and you don't need a great deal of room to grow them. Right, now in terms of the zonal plants, and indeed the stellas or the zonal hybrids, we have what run out of them as the variegated or gold leaf forms of them. They're basically different coloured leaves. We have gold leaf versions, which I can show you here, which are basically a very, very pale green. Some are more gold than others. In the summer, when they get a bit of sun on them, they tend to go a bit greener. And in the winter, perhaps in the spring and autumn, they're at their best when they have their best sort of colouring. Again, you can get a hint of a zone in them, sometimes more than others. So you can see that this is really very, very palest green. But all of the forms of the gold and the variegated leaves come from sort of genetic aberrations. Years ago, you would have perhaps found a little stem growing out of one of the zonals, which would have had a slight variegation of the stem and leaf, and these would have been cut off, preserved, cuttings taken, and that ultimately created new varieties. Right, and this one is a typical sort of bicolor. They come in two forms. They come in a bicolor, which in actual fact has arguably got three colours, because many of them still retain the bronze zoning. So this is green, you've got cream at the edge, and you've still got the bronze zoning in the middle. A number of people sort of do have one or two issues in growing the variegated leaf types, but I find you certainly need to give them a bit more shade than the zonals, and I find certainly in the strong main growing season from about May to sort of early part of September, they like to be kept a bit wetter than a good number of the ordinary zonals, so it's something to think about when you've got them. I, of course, did very well with Sammy Brown, which is a variety that I'll just show you now. Now, this is Sammy Brown, and I got the best in show with this plant last year. So this is a single flowering variety, and this has got what we call the spots and splashes regime, or paint box colouring, as it's sometimes called. This is sort of typical of, you know, a number of zonals can get this effect. It's often bred in, and if I take sort of seeds from this, it may or may not have it, but some people like it, some people don't. I don't mind it at all, but a number of Pelargonium specialists like to have solid colours, but I don't mind the paint box splish splash effect at all. Now, with the zonals, you do get some really unusual forms. This is, if anybody's familiar with a rather old variety called Mr Wren, this is the variegated form, which was actually found in Sweden by somebody. It was renamed a long Swedish name, but as far as I'm concerned, it's the variegated form of Mr Wren. But you can clearly see this has got a very, very unusual bloom. It's a single bloom, edged with white or creamy white, and a sort of a good bright sort of orange in the middle. Now, I've actually grown the green leaf version of this, and for me, the brick red always comes back and fills the bloom, but I find the variegated form, the blooms actually stay much more true to the Mr Wren form. So I'm continuing to grow that one. Okay, so what's next? Let's move on to some zonal hybrids. Now, the most notable zonal hybrid that I grow are the Stellar varieties. Now, they originate from some breeding done in Australia going back many, many decades. We basically ended up with a plant that has got sort of almost like half star shaped leaves. Because they're a zonal hybrid, which means that they're sort of the originals were crossed with zonals to produce these plants. They conform to the three main sizes of the zonals. So you get larger growing ones, you get dwarf ones, and you get miniature ones. So this is what I would class as a dwarf one, a little bit similar to the dwarfs. In the zonal side, you can grow them in a bigger pot to make a bigger version, which is what I do with this particular plant. But these have got the zone, they've often got the zone, more or less as per the zonal varieties, more zone. Some have more zone than others. Now the blooms are usually quite sort of spiky, a little bit unusual. The blooms are certainly different to the zonals. They're nicely rounded and really sort of bulbous. The blooms of Stellars tend to be quite spiky. They're both double and single, and I should have mentioned that for the zonals, of course. You can get double and single versions. On the Stellars, the blooms are very sort of almost spiky, and the double ones can be very full. Now these examples are only just starting to come out. Now this variegation of the Stellars is borne out quite well by the variety Mrs May Last. This was bred by Steve Pollard. Was originally released as a miniature, but realistically it's a dwarf. You got the good variegation of foliage. The white in sort of very sunny weather does tend to go over to a pink tinge, but this is a bicolor form of Stellar.